Been talking about the 7 railroads in North America, beginning with their beginning history, but then also really comparing from 1950. And so we're going to do some of the highlights of building the lines west of Havre. This shows the empire builder coming out of Glacier National Park in 1967 with the new SDP 45s. You can see it's a beautiful park. It's beautiful mountains. Here's the Great Northern in its entirety. Went from Chicago to St. Paul, Minneapolis to Seattle. And we cannot talk about the Great Northern without talking about the James J. Hill. He was a chief executive officer, and he was the Great Northern. It was his idea. He built it up. And because he was so influential on developing the Northwest United States, he was called the Empire Builder. And so just to review, Hill built west to Fargo and Grand Forks, and then to Havre, Montana, and established large shops there. And this is a picture I took in 1965 of the shops and to the right is the diesel house, and back is the roundhouse and turntable, and they've subsequently added 2 more additions. And so his philosophy was always to make each line profitable. So each of these he would build west in North Dakota, and then he would build a branch line and then another branch line. So he was constantly getting traffic, and he was making revenue as they built the line west. And this continued into Montana. He got a deal to haul, there's a huge copper mine, a deposit in Butte, and an open pit mine. And there was a smelter in Helena. And so he hauled copper ore from Butte to Helena. And then, of course, he hauled the copper ingots out and the material in. And so the line was profitable, and he was making money already when he was at Havre. And Great Northern was financially solid because of the philosophy. He made sure each line was profitable before he extended it. So here we see Havre. This is the downtown. This is the diesel shop and the roundhouse, and then the yard is back here. And then it all gathers, and then it comes out. There's 2 tracks as far as Pacific Junction. Now, initially, this is going west. This is a picture I took in 1970. But the line went straight west and kept right on going out this way towards Great Falls and Helena and Butte. Well, then after he had run that for a while, they decided they needed to build as he called it, a branch line to the west to Seattle. So that was a branch line. I thought that was pretty funny. And so he ended up with one of the best lines across the Rockies through Marias Pass, through the Rockies at Glacier National Park, and one of the worst crossings of the Sierra Nevada mountain chain at Stevens Pass, which are the Cascade Mountains in Washington. And so to review the placement of all this, here's Havre, Montana. This is Montana here, the middle of Montana, Havre, and here's the line to Great Falls. Here's Marias Pass. These are the Rockies coming down through here. And this is Marias Pass here. And then he went up through Idaho, down to Spokane. And then they built across. And Stevens Pass is about here. Here's where the Cascade mountains are. Also, at this time, in 1890, the Northern Pacific went into receivership again, because they had not taken the philosophy of building a lot of branch lines. They had a huge checkerboard of land grants, but that was land. So they were land rich, cash poor. And so he was able to take control of the NP. And then he began coordinating the management of the GN and NP, which lasted until 1970 when they were merged. So Hill's surveyors found a really good route through the Rocky Mountains at Marias Pass, also very scenic. Son Louis later created Glacier National Park right there. So he was president, Louis was president from 1907 to 1919. And before he became president, he pushed the development of Glacier National Park. He got an act through Congress, and they created the park. And Jim thought, well, this isn't going to be that big a deal. He was focusing on freight. That's what he knew. He said, well, that's nice to have that park, but it's not going to do much. Well, he said, but Louis, you're my son, and if you want to do this, we'll do this. And so for years, the Great Northern was the only transportation to the park, really. When I was a child, my grandparents loved to go to Glacier National Park. So we would drive out there. And there were stretches, this is in the 50s, there were stretches of Highway 2 that were still gravel. And so this was not something you just zip out there on the freeway. It was quite a long trip. And of course you had to watch for rocks from trucks and stuff like that. It was not a great drive. And so my grandfather always took the train, and I took the train with him. That's how I got interested in railroads, because he'd take me down to the roundhouse in Havre. So the Great Northern runs along the southern border of Glacier National Park. And you can see it on the right to the north. And in fact, the Great Northern Line really defined the southern border. Here's, if you can see my cursor, here's the Marias Pass, which is probably the best pass across the Rockies. It's as good as the Yellowhead Pass for the
Canadian National.
Much better than at 5,000 feet. It's much better than the Union Pacific has to go to 8,000 in Laramie, Wyoming, and Donner Pass in Nevada is I think that's up that high too. So then they go through Idaho, and then the Great Northern went down to Spokane. But when they were building Northern Pacific, which was before this, they looked at the Cascade Mountains right here, and they said, no, we don't want to do that. So they went down to what became Pasco and the Tri-Cities, and then they built up this way through the Stampede Tunnel, and then they went to Portland and then Seattle. So the NP took a different route. So here's the Stampede Tunnel. Now the BN closed this because they were running everything through Portland or across through the Cascade Tunnel. But as the traffic increased, and they found with the heavy trains, they needed to reopen it. So as I understand, it's still open now, and you can see they rebuilt the track and everything. So, but back to when they first crossed the Cascades, the 1893 they opened a temporary line because they're already there. And Stevens had found this pass. It is a pass across the Cascades, but they're younger than the Rockies, so they're much steeper. But they had 4% grades and a summit at 4,000 feet. So here's a map of the area just for the Stevens Pass. Now Highway 2 is this red line right here, and the original line, here's the Great Northern coming up out of here, and this is 1893. And then they had to put in switchbacks like they have down in Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia. And they actually, would pull up, and then they back the train up, and then they would pull across and then back the train down and go over here and then back it around again. And then they ended up here, which became Wellington. And then they go on this thing, and they had to build another tunnel. So this is the route from 1893 to 1900. And so obviously they're not moving a lot of freight over this thing, but at least they did have a line, and they could move something, and they could get passenger trains across it. But the bad problem, and our resident expert really told us that this was the problem. It was easier construction, but they built on the north side of the river, and so the sun hits the snow in the afternoon, and then it melts, and then they have avalanches, and so and that really led to problems. Obviously, in 1912, so the line's been open for a little while. That it was a very heavy year of snow, and a westbound and an eastbound passenger train, probably the Oriental Limited, were stopped at Wellington. Wellington was this place just west of the pass. And they couldn't get, so they had guys out trying to open the line. Well, they're just sitting there, and the people are warm. That the steam engines are running, and they got steam in the cars. But an avalanche comes down, killed 96 people. It's one of the worst train accidents in U.S. history, and of course a lot of people injured, and it was very devastating for everybody. So they changed the name of Wellington to Tye, Tye. I have no idea why they did that, but they did. And then they built the first Cascade tunnel was right here. They had to get rid of all this stuff with the switchbacks, so they built the first Cascade tunnel here. But it unfortunately still ended up coming out at Wellington, where so the stuff came out. The trains came out of in 1912. They came out of the Cascade tunnel, but they got hit by the avalanche, and they electrified it because of the steam, the smoke from the locomotives. And they actually used a 3-phase alternating current system. So they had 2 trolley poles here, one for each of the AC phases, and then the third phase went down through the track.
Okay.
But they electrified it so they would bank the fires for the steam locomotives, and then they would pull the train through with these electric locomotives. So that worked pretty well. But they realized that they still had this problem at the upper elevations, and so they decided that they had to build the big tunnel. And so here's the first Cascade tunnel. It still exists. It's still out there. But anyway, they built the big
But not
tunnel.
in use though.
No,
It's not in use though.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's they got a little barricade there, but I bet you a lot of people walk through it.
Yeah.
I don't know if part of it's collapsed or not. Well, it looks like it's the line, so it's probably still there.
Couldn't get me in there.
No, I
I would think they
there
would
either.
have sealed it off somewhere in there.
Yeah, you
If
think so?
Nothing else, you can get a place where there's not enough oxygen to live.
Yeah, could be.
Would that kill the snakes?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Thank you.
trip over a sleeping bear.
yeah, that's right. So in 1929, they built the new Cascade Tunnel, and that was 7.7 miles long. It eliminated 6 miles of snow sheds and 5 complete circles of curvature, and they electrified. It's on a grade, so they had to run the engine, so they had to electrify it. And so they had bought these big Westinghouse electrics, and they went to after the 3-phase system. They went to a standard, like 8,000 volt AC, and then their motor generator sets inside the locomotives, and then they run 600 volt standard 600 volt DC traction motors. And so here's but when the diesels came along, all of a sudden they realized, well, eventually they got rid of the electrics because it took so long to take the electric locomotives off, and it was very cumbersome. So they thought, well, with the diesel electrics, there's not that much smoke. Well, it was a problem. And so they had to build these elaborate fans here and doors. So they close the doors, and then they run the train through, and then they blow air through it. But it takes an hour. So there's your favorite, Craig, GP30. That's the first GP30 that Great Northern bought. It must be a publicity shot. But it's a terrible design. It's on the grade, so it was not too bad with electric locomotives, but the diesels have to work through the tunnel, and so they have to close the door, and it limits 1 to 20 trains a day, which our resident expert said that was about half of what the line could haul. And so again, it's 7.7 miles long, 2,800 feet and of elevation. A few years ago, Trains magazine did an expose on it, and it was the first time I'd really seen a scathing critique of the Cascade Tunnel. And I thought, boy, is this true? Well, our expert said that absolutely correct. In fact, it wasn't even as critical as it should have been. He said it's a mess because of the way where they built it, and building the thing on a grade the way they did it. It's just it's a mess. And it sort of clears the air out, but boy, they're going through there, it's not great for the crews. So anyway, they originally they had these nice electric locomotives, and then they'd have to haul this is with a passenger train, so they had to have a steam heater car, but that doesn't produce much smoke. So they have a heater car, and then these electric locomotives. And then later, as the trains got heavier, they put 2 electric locomotives on there.
Hmm.
Now this is a sort of an interesting locomotive. It's one of these Y locomotives. It's a Westinghouse Y, class Y. But it rolled down an embankment, and I don't know what happened to the crew. I couldn't find out. But anyway, the locomotive was okay, but obviously the car body was destroyed.
Mhm.
So they sent it back to General Motors, and they put an F unit cab on the front and the back, and then filled in and so they ended up with this thing that looks like a double-ended F unit, but it's an electric.
Huh.
And the Lionel actually used this, and they produced an electric locomotive for Great Northern, but they used the model, a pretty good model of the one that was on the New Haven. It was a GE. But this thing is a Westinghouse underneath there. So, well, then as the trains got heavier in the 50s, the Great Northern went back to General Electric and said, well, we got to build, you got to build us some new locomotives. And so this is called a W class, and they're 5,000 horsepower. And so they get the high voltage AC, they rectify it to direct current. And so it's it's a 4884. It has 4 axles and 4 motors here, 4 motors there. So 8 axles and 5,000 horsepower. So they're very powerful. But it was, again, keeping the Canton area up and switching out locomotives was very difficult. So they went to the diesels. The GN and the NP, again, this was being run by Jim Hill. They built the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. And so here's Spokane, then it runs down to the Tri-Cities, a different line than the NP. There's the NP over here, and this is the Spokane, and very modern construction. It was built later, so they had more modern, mini tunnels, very low grades, long curves, and then they built on the north side of the Columbia River over to Portland. And then the Seattle actually was they used the NP line, and they had an agreement with the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, and the Union Pacific all used that line. And now it's the GN and the BNSF and the UP. But later this line was abandoned, and they went back to the old NP because when they built this new SP&S line, the drainage was terrible. So they had to go back to the old line, because they just couldn't. It was always underwater, and the track would sink and everything. So Jim Hill was always continuing to expand. So he has the SP&S here. He built a bridge across the Columbia River, and then he built the GN south into Oregon, up the Deschutes River. Now there's a chain of mountains here with Mount Hood and some of the others. That kind of runs over here and then ends up at this Blue Mountains. And the Deschutes River carved a canyon as it drains this whole area of Oregon into the Columbia River. Well, then, of course, we had got into the fight because the UP wanted to build one too, because they're right there. And so they ended up with a war, just like in the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe down in Colorado. They're tearing up each other's tracks and shooting each other and stuff. Well, finally, they went to court. And it ended up that the Great Northern owned this section of track here through the Deschutes River, but the UP had trackage rights. So then the GN owns part of this, and then their trackage rights on the SP for a while. Then they own some more track, and then they connect with the Western Pacific. And so the Great Northern was able to run traffic down this way to connect with the Western Pacific, and then at Stockton they connect with the Santa Fe, and so they could run traffic to San Francisco and Los Angeles and the Valley. And the BN continued that, and the BNSF continues today to run some traffic that way.